Pacific skies, 1943. The morning light rises over Guadalcanal, a molten horizon, cut by palm silhouettes and the slow churn of engines at Henderson Field. Ground crews crouch beside glistening aluminum, wiping condensation from leading edges. The air tastes of salt and oil. Two pilots step from the revetment, helmets slung, oxygen masks dangling. They're young, 21, 22, but they walk like men who've already seen too much sky. Ahead of them waits something no one quite trusts yet. Twin booms stretching wide as a barn. Twin propellers angled inward like mirrored scythes. A central pod for the pilot. And between those booms, a promise of speed no one believed a heavy fighter could keep. Checklist. Boost pumps. Flaps. Throttles forward. The twin Allison V-1710 engines roar alive, each coughing into a deep metallic growl. Turbo superchargers spool to a shrill whine, sending tremors through the steel mat runway. The air quivers behind the exhausts, blue flame licking against the damp tropical air. A quick glance between pilots. Thumbs up. The sound doubles as the second Lightning spools. Then, brakes released. The P-38 surges forward, tail steady, nose leveled. At 90 knots, the heavy fighter leaves the Earth like it's lighter than belief itself. Gear up, throttles to war emergency power. The Allisons strain, pushing 3,200 combined horsepower into a sky that parts in white vapor trails. At 5,000 feet, then 10,000, the island falls away beneath them. The others watch from the ground, heads tilted back, unable to comprehend how a twin-engine aircraft climbs faster than single-seat interceptors. The sunlight flashes off the twin tails, and then it's gone, vanishing into cloud, a silver cross disappearing into the blue. No one speaks for a moment. Someone finally mutters, "Damn thing climbs like a rocket." The dream of altitude, 1937 to 1940. In the late 1930s, the world's militaries were racing toward the future. The biplane era was dying, and every air force on Earth was searching for altitude. The higher you flew, the safer you were. The United States Army Air Corps knew it lagged behind Europe's rapid aviation developments. Germany had unveiled the Bf-109. Britain was perfecting the Spitfire. The U.S. had the Seversky P-35 and Curtiss P-36, serviceable, but ordinary. Then came Specification X-608, a bold challenge written in 1937. The Air Corps demanded a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, climbing at unheard-of rates, and sustaining heavy armament. It was a paper dream, until a 27-year-old engineer at Lockheed named Clarence Kelly Johnson decided to answer it. Johnson and his small design team worked out of a rented hangar in Burbank, California, a space so small that mechanics had to roll components outside to turn them around. They called themselves the Skunk Works, though the term wouldn't become official until later. Their concept looked like nothing in the sky. Two slender booms housing engines and turbo superchargers, a central nacelle for the pilot and guns, and a tricycle landing gear like a futuristic insect poised to leap. It would be called the Lockheed Model 22, soon designated XP-38 Lightning. The radical layout Johnson's design solved one of aviation's nagging problems: gun convergence. In conventional fighters, wing-mounted guns fired streams that met at a single point, usually around 300 yards out. The P-38's nose-mounted armament, one 20mm Hispano cannon, and four 50-caliber Browning machine guns, fired straight ahead, converging naturally with perfect precision. No adjustment, no spread. Every round carried the same deadly focus. The engines were the true gamble. Instead of one, Johnson insisted on two Allison V-1710 engines, each producing roughly 1,000 horsepower in early tests. To maintain control and cancel out torque, the props rotated in opposite directions, counter-rotating propellers, spinning inward at the top. It meant no vicious roll during takeoff, no torque-induced stall in a climb. For its day, it was revolutionary engineering. Above each engine sat a General Electric turbo supercharger, feeding compressed air for high-altitude combustion. While most fighters gasped for oxygen at 25,000 feet, the Lightning's turbos kept its Allisons breathing strong well beyond 30,000. The Air Corps' test pilots were skeptical. Few believed an aircraft so large could meet their interceptor demand. They were wrong. The Transcontinental. Flight January 11, 1939. The XP-38 was ready for its defining moment. A cross-country flight from Marchfield, California, to Mitchell Field, New York. It was a public relations gamble, a chance to prove the new interceptor could outrun time itself. Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, test pilot and believer in the twin-engine dream, took off at dawn. He climbed swiftly over the desert, leveling at 20,000 feet. With fuel tanks jettisoned, the Lightning slashed across America at over 340 mph. For hours, it covered states like pages turning beneath its wings. But as Kelsey descended toward New York, ice formed on the carburetor intakes. Visibility dropped. Just short of the runway, the XP-38 lost power and crashed onto a golf course. Kelsey survived. The prototype was destroyed. To the public, it was a failure. To the Air Corps, it was a revelation. The Lightning had flown coast to coast in record time. Only its landing had failed. Within weeks, the Army ordered 13 YP-38s for evaluation. Early lessons and turbulent progress. By 1940, Europe was burning. France had fallen. Britain was under siege. American isolationism kept the nation technically out of the war, but the urgency of rearmament grew with every bombing raid over London. Lockheed's Burbank plant roared into life. Hundreds of engineers worked double shifts. Test flights ran around the clock. Each new Lightning refined the last. The YP-38 solved cooling issues and strengthened tail structures. Test dives uncovered new mysteries. The aircraft shuddered violently beyond 420 mph, a phenomenon pilots couldn't explain. Engineers didn't yet know the term compressibility, where approaching transonic speeds caused airflow separation and near loss of control. For now, they simply marked "Do not exceed" red lines on the airspeed indicator and kept flying. Still, the P-38 was faster than any production fighter in the U.S. arsenal. It climbed to 20,000 feet in less than 7 minutes and could reach over 400 mph at altitude. It was heavy, yes, over 14,000 pounds fully loaded, but the twin engines gave it the muscle to defy that weight. Forging a symbol, when the first production P-38s rolled out of Burbank, they looked almost alien compared to their peers. Mechanics and pilots dubbed it the fork-tailed devil. The German nickname Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel would come later, from those who learned to fear its silhouette. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the P-38 wasn't just another fighter. It was a philosophy shift, a belief that altitude and range could win wars. With self-sealing tanks, turbo-supercharged engines, and concentrated firepower, it represented industrial confidence molded into metal. In early trials, pilots marveled at its stability. With tricycle landing gear, it was easier to handle on takeoff and landing than taildraggers. It could fly on one engine, a godsend in combat zones stretching thousands of miles from base. In an era where engine failure usually meant death, the Lightning offered something priceless, a second chance. But war was coming faster than production lines could keep pace. As 1941 dawned, Europe's skies were filled with Messerschmitts and Hurricanes, and the Lightning was still perfecting its fit and finish. Engineers were learning, pilots were training, and Washington was deciding whether America would remain a bystander. That decision ended on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into global war. Overnight, experimental designs became urgent necessities. Lockheed received massive orders, not for dozens, but for thousands of aircraft. Assembly lines multiplied. Burbank expanded. The Lightning, once a curiosity, became the cornerstone of American long-range fighter power. And now the challenge was not just to make it fly, but to make it fight. As the first combat squadrons prepared for deployment, the Lightning's promise would be tested in the bitter air over Europe and in the furnace of the Pacific. It would face problems, pilots' doubts, and weather that froze turbochargers solid. But it would also discover something few aircraft could ever claim: the ability to climb away from almost anything on Earth. That realization began in the war's earliest years, as America's engineers and airmen learned that victory would depend not on the number of guns, but on the power to reach higher first. The Lightning's destiny was no longer theoretical. It was airborne. Next comes the world it entered: frozen Europe, burning skies, and the Pacific's boundless expanse. First combat, first lessons, 1942-1943. When the first squadrons of P-38 Lightnings arrived in Europe, they came carrying both pride and uncertainty. On paper, the Lightning was the most advanced fighter the U.S. had ever built. In the air, the cold realities of the European theater exposed its weaknesses mercilessly. The climate over the British Isles was nothing like the Californian skies it was designed under. Moist air froze around the turbo superchargers. Cockpits turned into iceboxes. Radio interference from the long turbocharger conduits garbled transmissions between formations. Early models lacked cockpit heating altogether. Pilots flew wearing multiple layers, oxygen masks frosting with every breath. But when it worked, when the engines held, when the turbos spun properly, the P-38 could climb higher, faster, and stay aloft longer than any American fighter before it. Its range reached over 1,300 miles with drop tanks, its ceiling nearly 45,000 feet. In 1942, that was beyond imagination for a twin-engine fighter. Yet the war in Europe was unforgiving. At those altitudes, German Bf-109s and FW-190s waited, optimized for mid to high-altitude interception. The Lightning's big profile made it an easy target in tight dogfights. Early versions without dive recovery flaps suffered from compressibility shocks, deadly nose tuck that killed more pilots than combat in the beginning. In steep dives, the tail buffeted violently as airflow detached from the control surfaces. More than one Lightning simply did not pull out. Lockheed's engineers in Burbank worked feverishly with field reports. Dive recovery flaps were added under the wings, restoring control near transonic speeds. Cooling systems were improved, heaters installed, and the P-38F and G models gained tougher skin and better engines. But even as technology advanced, the European skies remained a graveyard of trial and error. It was in another theater, half a world away, that the Lightning would finally meet its element. Across the Pacific, 1943 to 1944, the Pacific was a war of distances. Vast, endless blue stretching between island chains and jungled coastlines. Fighters that excelled over Europe simply couldn't reach the fight here. Japan's A6M0 reigned supreme across the ocean, light, agile, and long-legged. American P-40s and Wildcats lacked the range to chase it. Then the P-38 arrived. Its twin engines gave it endurance and safety over water that single-engine planes could never match. Its turbo superchargers loved the hot, dense air near the equator. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers hundreds of miles across the Solomon Islands, the Bismarck Archipelago, and into the Philippines. Pilots of the 49th and 475th Fighter Groups began to realize they could dictate altitude. Japanese Zeros climbed well, up to about 25,000 feet, but the P-38s could simply go higher. From 30,000 feet and above, they struck from above like diving hawks, their nose-mounted guns converging with laser precision. A 2-second burst could disintegrate a Zero before it ever saw the attacker. The Lightning's speed in a dive, nearly 450 meter-in-paters, allowed pilots to hit, then break off in safety. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. The Pacific transformed the P-38's reputation. What had been temperamental in England became untouchable over New Guinea. American aces like Major Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles MacDonald began carving their names into history, racking up dozens of kills. Bong alone would score 40 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring American ace of the war, and every one of them in a P-38. In this theater, The Lightning's climb rate was legendary. With war emergency power, the late-model Lightnings, P-38J and L, could generate up to 1,600 horsepower per Allison engine, a staggering 3,200 combined horsepower. Even loaded with ammunition and drop tanks, they reached 20,000 feet in just over 6 minutes. Enemy pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing: a twin-engine aircraft ascending faster than their lightest. Interceptors' evolution of power. Each variant refined the formula. The P-38H introduced new intercoolers and strengthened wings. The P-38J replaced the complex leading-edge cooling system with chin-mounted radiators, reducing drag and improving reliability. The P-38L, the ultimate wartime model, carried paddle blade propellers, boosted ailerons, and uprated Allisons that could briefly sustain 1,600 HP at takeoff and climb with water injection. This was the version that earned the phrase, "climbed like a rocket." The aircraft's vertical performance wasn't just mechanical, it was strategic. On scattered island bases, when radar picked up incoming raids, Lightnings could be airborne and climbing through cloud before enemy bombers reached visual range. While other fighters circled low to gain altitude, the twin-boomed giants were already above the formation, throttles open, ready to dive. Their ascent was so steep that Japanese observers often mistook them for new American rocket planes. The myth spread faster than reports could correct it. But behind the myth lay hard engineering truth. Two turbocharged Allisons turning counter to each other, each fed by precise airflow, delivering symmetrical thrust without torque roll. In a climb, that meant stability and acceleration without the usual yaw or drift. When one engine failed, the Lightning still climbed on the other. Slowly, yes, but enough to limp home. Pilots learned to trust it with their lives. In the humid expanse of the South Pacific, that trust meant everything. Training and doctrine. The P-38 demanded discipline. Its cockpit was crowded with levers, throttles, prop governors, mixture turbo controls, intercooler flaps, cowl flaps, each affecting climb and speed. New pilots called it the engineer's airplane, but those who mastered it discovered unmatched control at altitude. American tactics shifted accordingly. P-38 squadrons operated in pairs or flights of 4, maintaining altitude dominance. They became the top cover for bombers and P-47 or P-51 units below. In Pacific missions, Lightnings escorted B-24s across hundreds of miles of open ocean, something no single-engine fighter dared attempt at the time. Reconnaissance variants. The F-4 and F-5 Lightnings used the same engines and high-altitude climb to carry cameras instead of guns. They photographed enemy bases, fleets, and coastlines, sometimes flying alone at 35,000 feet. Their images would guide invasions from the Solomons to the Philippines. Everywhere they went, ground crews learned to listen for that distinct twin whine of the turbos spooling up, a sound that signaled hope and protection. From technology to legacy, by mid-1944, the Lightning had become more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American reach, of technology meeting necessity. Where the early years had been plagued by teething pains, the later ones were defined by superiority. The P-38's climb, the very thing pilots once doubted, had become its signature. Whether intercepting Japanese bombers over Rabaul or escorting photo recon missions over Burma, its ascent meant dominance. Lockheed's engineers, Kelly Johnson foremost among them, continued refining turbo systems and propeller efficiency right until the war's final months. They understood that altitude meant options, and options won wars. When a P-38 left the ground and began its spiral skyward, it didn't just climb. It expanded the battlefield, reaching ranges and altitudes the enemy couldn't contest. The Lightning had found its element, and with it, the role that would define it. Now, to truly understand why the world couldn't believe its climb, we must see it from every angle. The pilots who flew it, the engineers who built it, and the enemies who faced it. Continue to Section 1 of Angles. Angle A, the human element. The men behind the controls. It began with nerves. Even among seasoned American pilots, the P-38 Lightning inspired both awe and fear. Nothing about it looked familiar. Not the twin booms, not the tricycle landing gear, not the cluster of levers and gauges crammed into its cockpit. It was, as one instructor said, like stepping into a machine that thinks faster than you do. Training schools across California and Florida filled with young airmen fresh out of flight school. They'd trained on AT-6 Texans, nimble and simple, and now faced an aircraft that demanded not instinct but management. The Lightning wasn't just flown. It was handled. Every student learned early. The Allisons were powerful, but they were temperamental. Turbo superchargers, controlled by wastegate levers, could easily overspeed if mismanaged. One wrong throttle move could melt turbine blades. Engine temperatures climbed fast on the ground. You had to get it rolling quickly. The first solo takeoff in a P-38 was unforgettable. The nose rose cleanly, no torque twist, no yaw, an almost eerie smoothness. Pilots accustomed to fighting their aircraft felt nothing, no vibration, no sway, just thrust. And once the gear locked up, the Lightning began its ritual climb. Those who mastered the twin-engined beast came to love it fiercely. They called her the Big Sister, heavy but protective. Lose an engine and you could still make it home. The long flights over endless Pacific water demanded faith in machinery, and the Lightning gave that faith back tenfold. But the workload was immense. You were a one-man orchestra, recalled 475th Group Ace Thomas McGuire. Throttle, prop pitch, turbos, mixture, each needed attention. If you fell behind, she'd bite. In the early months, that bite came often. Pilots overboosted turbos, overheated engines, or lost control in dives. But by 1943, training had evolved. Simulator rigs replicated turbo behavior. Instructors drilled emergency procedures into muscle memory. A generation of Lightning pilots emerged, engineers in the air, soldiers in the heart. They were different from the Spitfire romantics or Mustang chasers. They fought vertically with patience and calculation. They trusted their instruments. They understood numbers, manifold pressure, RPM, fuel flow. And when they pushed both throttles forward to war emergency power, they felt what few men ever could. 3,200 horsepower clawing them skyward, prop tips turning supersonic, the aircraft trembling not from fear, but from triumph. For many, that climb was spiritual. Rising through humid Pacific cloud, the twin engines roaring evenly, the Lightning felt alive, a metallic being breathing fire and air. It wasn't poetry then, but it reads like it now. Angle B, the tactical philosophy. Altitude as a weapon. Every fighter in the war sought speed. The Lightning sought altitude. American air doctrine before 1942 emphasized quantity and formation fighting. Pilots of the P-40 and P-39 were trained to stay low, protect bombers, and engage head-on. The P-38 changed that entirely. It redefined how altitude could be used offensively. The Pacific offered endless open air, perfect for the Lightning's strengths. Its climb rate, combined with high cruise efficiency, meant it could start a fight at 30,000 feet and finish it 10,000 feet lower before the enemy even responded. From that height, gravity became its weapon. P-38 formations, usually pairs or elements, would orbit in the sun's glare, invisible to Japanese spotters. When radar picked up incoming aircraft, they would dive steeply, firing in short bursts with those 5 nose guns, 4 50 cals, and one 20mm cannon concentrated into a fist of lead. A single 2-second burst delivered over 100 rounds. Unlike wing-mounted guns that spread out, every round from the Lightning hit the same spot. Against fragile Zero airframes, it was annihilation. The tactic earned a name: boom and zoom. Hit from altitude, escape in a dive, and climb again. It turned the P-38 into a vertical predator, feeding off energy, not maneuver. In Europe, where enemy aircraft could match its climb, this tactic was risky. But in the Pacific, where Japanese fighters were optimized for turning at medium altitudes, it was perfect. Pilots like Dick Bong learned to never turn fight. Instead, they used altitude like a savings account, trading it for speed when needed, then climbing back to safety. Each engagement became a physics problem solved in seconds. If the Lightning started above, it ended victorious. If it started below, the pilot disengaged and climbed away. The P-38's twin engines added a tactical security net. Over enemy waters, an engine hit didn't mean death. A pilot could throttle down one side, feather the prop, and still limp hundreds of miles home. Many who should have been lost to the ocean lived to fight again because of that redundancy. And in escort missions, that climb advantage saved bombers. Over New Guinea and the Philippines, Lightnings reached altitude fast enough to meet inbound raids head-on, long before the slower P-40s arrived. For heavy bombers like the B-24 Liberator, those extra 3 or 4 minutes often meant survival. In 1944, when the Yamamoto interception was planned, one of the most precise aerial assassinations in history, it was the Lightning's climb and range that made it possible. Only the P-38 could reach the required altitude and distance for the ambush. That mission would become the most famous demonstration of what climb, reach, and planning could achieve. But behind every vertical maneuver, there was an engineer's dream, one realized in aluminum, turbochargers, and math, angle C. The technological edge, power in symmetry. The P-38 was a machine of equations. Every inch of its design served the goal of balancing power, stability, and climb. The key lay in symmetrical thrust. By using counter-rotating propellers, the left turning clockwise, the right counterclockwise, Lockheed neutralized torque effects. This allowed full-throttle climbs without the usual rolling pull found in single-prop fighters. In combat, it meant a Lightning could pitch up sharply without losing alignment or yaw control. Above that mechanical symmetry came aerodynamic innovation. The twin-boom layout was more than aesthetic. It reduced drag by distributing the load of twin engines and radiators along streamlined pods, while keeping the center nacelle compact for the pilot and guns. The result was low drag and high lift, essential for steep climbs. Turbo supercharging was the heart of its vertical power. Unlike mechanical superchargers driven by engine RPM, the General Electric turbos used exhaust gases to spin compressors, feeding dense air into the Allisons regardless of altitude. This meant the Lightning maintained full power up to 30,000 feet, while most Japanese and German engines suffocated above $20,000. The turbo's scream, that high metallic whistle, became the aircraft's trademark. Ground crews described it as a ghostly sound that arrived before the Lightning itself. Cooling was another triumph of engineering struggle. Early P-38s used leading-edge intercoolers within the wings, but they created maintenance headaches and drag. Later models adopted chin-mounted radiators, reshaping airflow for efficiency and ease of service. This gave the P-38J and L their recognizable shark-like look, and freed the engines to run hotter, longer, and harder. At maximum climb power, each Allison V-1710, 111, or 113 variant produced over 1,600 horsepower for brief periods, supported by water injection that cooled cylinders and prevented detonation. Pilots described the surge of thrust as like being kicked by a giant hand. In testing, the Lightning could reach 20,000 feet in 6.5 minutes and continue climbing beyond 40,000. No Allied twin-engine fighter came close. Every innovation, from aileron boost systems to dive recovery flaps, was born of brutal necessity. Pilots pushed too hard, the plane dove too fast, and Lockheed fixed the problem. The Lightning was an evolving organism. The result wasn't perfection, but something more powerful. Balance, a blend of endurance, speed, and precision firepower that defied logic for its size. From the outside, it looked heavy and slow. From the cockpit, it felt alive, a paradox of grace and power. And when both throttles hit full boost, the Lightning didn't so much climb as rise. Every ascent, every burst of acceleration, every streak of contrails was the product of these interlocking angles. Human courage, tactical brilliance, and technological daring. But there were more sides to the story. The commanders who gambled their reputations on it, the enemies who faced it in disbelief, and the moral weight of what power like this meant in a world at war. Angles. Part 2 Angle. D. Leadership and Vision. Kelly Johnson and the Commanders, who believed at the heart of every great machine lies a human vision. For the P-38 Lightning, that vision belonged to Clarence Kelly Johnson, a quiet, analytical engineer with a relentless drive to turn imagination into hardware. Johnson was not a military man, but he understood combat better than many who wore uniforms. To him, altitude, speed, and range were more than performance charts. They were survival equations. When the Army Air Corps handed Lockheed the 1937 specification, most manufacturers played safe. Johnson refused. He drafted sketches that looked like science fiction. "If it doesn't look right," he told his team, "it probably isn't." The Model 22 looked right. Sleek, balanced, purposeful. Johnson fought for his design through skepticism, budget battles, and bureaucracy. The Army doubted that a twin-engine interceptor could outclimb a single-engine fighter. Some officers called it a bomber with delusions. Johnson disagreed. He tested every limit, personally signing off on each aerodynamic change. He demanded data, not opinion. That same philosophy echoed years later in the field. Commanders like General George C. Kenney of the 5th Air Force in the Pacific understood the Lightning's potential where others did not. Kenney was a strategist who believed that control of altitude and range could shift entire campaigns. He saw in the P-38 not just an aircraft, but a tool of reach. Under Kenney's command, pilots were ordered to exploit what the Lightning did best: climb fast, strike hard, escape clean. He paired experienced men with rookies, insisted on altitude discipline, and built missions around vertical advantage. Another believer was Colonel Charles "Mac" McDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group. He demanded precision flying, formations tight, climbs synchronized, attacks coordinated. Altitude, he told his squadrons, is time. The more you have, the longer you live. In every theater, leadership determined whether the P-38 would thrive or falter. In Europe, conservative doctrine and cold weather grounded its promise. In the Pacific, bold commanders unleashed it, and the results rewrote air warfare. Johnson, back in Burbank, never stopped improving the machine. He took pilot feedback personally. Letters describing compressor stalls or dive problems often landed on his desk within days of a mission. Each complaint became a blueprint revision. When Lockheed introduced the P-38J's chin radiators, it was a direct response to frontline feedback, the result of engineers listening to warriors. The collaboration between designers and pilots was rare in wartime, but it made the Lightning what it became: a fighter that evolved alongside the men who flew it. Angle E, through enemy eyes. The fork-tailed devil to the enemy. The P-38 was something alien. In Europe, German pilots first reported sightings in late 1942. At high altitude, contrails revealed twin white streaks converging toward bomber formations. Luftwaffe radio chatter described Zwillingsjäger, twin fighters, approaching faster than expected. When they finally saw it, confusion turned to alarm. Its size suggested a bomber, yet it moved like a fighter. Its profile, those twin booms framing a central nacelle, became instantly recognizable. German intelligence initially thought it was twin-seat. They couldn't believe one pilot controlled that much power. The nickname soon followed: Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf pilots learned to respect its climb. At medium altitude, the Bf-109 could match its turn rate, but above 25,000 feet, the Lightning pulled away. Its turbo-superchargers kept power consistent where German DB601 engines began to choke. In dives, the P-38's stability, after the addition of dive recovery flaps, meant it could escape any engagement by diving through compressibility, barriers the German fighters dared not approach. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots faced a different terror. The A-6M-0 and Kai-43 Oscar were lightweight, superb at low-altitude maneuvering, but their engines were single-stage, air-cooled designs optimized for agility, not altitude. When the Lightning appeared high above, descending in vapor-streaked fury, there was little defense. Reports from captured Japanese airmen spoke of twin silver dragons that appeared suddenly from the sun, striking faster than eyes could follow. Some even claimed the Americans were using rocket-powered planes. They weren't. They were witnessing turbocharged engineering. Psychologically, the P-38 changed the tone of aerial encounters. It stripped away the comfort of expectation. The enemy no longer knew whether an approaching formation was a bomber, a fighter, or something in between. Its sheer silhouette carried an aura of inevitability, of altitude advantage, and unstoppable momentum. Enemy intelligence officers began instructing pilots to dive away at the first sight of twin booms. They often didn't make it far enough. Angle F. The moral and logistical dimensions. Power at a price war's brilliance always carries a cost. For the Lightning, that cost came in both metal and men. The P-38 was expensive, roughly twice the production cost of a P-40. Each aircraft required precision-machined turbo components, specialized alloys, and long assembly times. Maintaining them on forward island strips was a logistical nightmare. Salt air corroded intercooler ducts. Tropical humidity fouled electrical systems. Spare parts had to arrive by barge or C-47 transport across thousands of miles of ocean. Ground crews became miracle workers. They cannibalized wrecks for spares, improvised cooling repairs with scrap aluminum, and bled knuckles on turbo housings in the dark. One mechanic later said, "The Lightning didn't forgive carelessness. You learned her language, or she taught you the hard way." Fuel consumption was another challenge. At high boost, the Allisons drank aviation gasoline faster than supply lines could deliver. But commanders accepted the cost. Altitude and speed saved lives. Then came the moral cost. The Lightning's unmatched firepower, 5 guns firing straight ahead, made kills brutally efficient. A short burst tore enemy aircraft apart before pilots could bail out. Aerial combat had always been deadly. The Lightning made it instantaneous. For reconnaissance pilots in F-4 and F-5 Lightnings, the moral weight was quieter but heavier. They flew unarmed, often alone, photographing enemy cities from 35,000 feet. Many never returned, shot down before they ever saw the fighters chasing them. Yet the images they brought back, Rabaul, Truk, Leyte, decided battles and saved tens of thousands on the ground. One pilot wrote in his logbook, "We climbed until the world turned black. Somewhere below, men were dying for what we saw." By 1944, the P-38 had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of industrial will. Its engines embodied America's belief that power, if harnessed correctly, could shorten the war. Its climb was not just aerodynamic, it was metaphorical. It represented ascent out of chaos, out of vulnerability, toward dominance. But that dominance would soon be tested in ways even its creators couldn't imagine. New enemies, new missions, and moments where the Lightning's incredible climb would decide not just battles, but the course of history itself. The stage was set for its greatest test, a mission so precise, so dependent on speed and altitude, that success seemed impossible on paper. And yet, it succeeded, changing the Pacific War forever. Operation Vengeance, the mission that shouldn't have worked, April 18, 1943. Early morning, deep in the South Pacific. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 2 squadrons of P-38G Lightnings sat fueled to the brim, engines ticking in the humidity. The men around them didn't yet realize they were about to make aviation history. Their target was not a convoy or an airfield. It was a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American cryptographers had broken JN-25, Japan's top military code. They'd intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of frontline bases around Bougainville. The itinerary listed exact times, routes, and altitudes. For the first time, the U.S. knew precisely where one of Japan's most important leaders would be, and when. The problem was distance. Yamamoto's transport flight from Rabaul to Bougainville would cover nearly 500 miles each way, far beyond the reach of most American fighters, except one. Only the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allisons and immense range, could make the trip. Even then, it was a knife-edge operation. 1,000 miles round trip, low-altitude ingress to avoid radar, timed intercept down to the minute. Brigadier General Nathan Twining approved the mission. Command fell to Major John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron. The operation received a code name, Vengeance. The plan Mitchell's task force consisted of 18 P-38Gs, each stripped of unnecessary weight and fitted with long-range drop tanks, 165 gallons each. The mission's flight path required exact fuel calculations. If they climbed too soon or diverted off course by even a few degrees, they would not make it home. Takeoff was scheduled for 7:00 a.m. The pilots would fly at 50 feet above the ocean, using terrain masking and Earth's curvature to remain undetected. Navigation depended on stopwatch precision and dead reckoning. No radar, no GPS, no landmarks but the endless Pacific. They had to be at a single patch of sky, over Bougainville at exactly 9:35 a.m. The time Yamamoto's twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were scheduled to arrive. The math was merciless. An 1,100-mile mission requiring exact timing within 1 minute of accuracy. Only a handful of men believed it was even possible. The climb at dawn, propellers turned. The air filled with the synchronized roar of 36 turbo superchargers spooling up in harmony. The Lightnings rolled down the steel matting and lifted off one by one, disappearing into the sea haze. For the first 2 hours they skimmed barely above the water. Throttles at cruise, conserving every ounce of fuel. Sweat rolled down inside oxygen masks. The engines droned hypnotically. The Pacific shimmered in all directions. No land, no horizon. Then, at the precise moment marked on Mitchell's watch, he signaled the climb. Throttles forward. Turbos whined to full pitch. The Lightnings began to rise. 1,000 feet. 5,000. 10,000. The altimeters spun like clock hands. The formation stretched in perfect geometry, silver arcs against the blue. Even in that moment of tension, the pilots felt the rush of their machine's ascent. The power of two 1,400 horsepower engines per aircraft, pulling them upward faster than gravity's patience. At 18,000 feet, they leveled off. Sunlight flashed off the twin booms. Below, the Solomon Islands lay like green jewels scattered across blue glass. They had arrived early, by about 1 minute. Mitchell's planning had been nearly flawless. Then, one of the wingmen shouted over the radio, "Bogies! 11 o'clock low." The encounter far below, dark specks crossed the coastline of Bougainville. 2 Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, moving exactly as the decrypted message had predicted. Mitchell ordered his top cover of 4 Lightnings to remain high and guard against interceptors. The rest of the group peeled off into a shallow dive. Engines screamed. The Lightnings accelerated through 400 meter and Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber were the first to sight the bombers clearly. The formation was tight. Yamamoto's aircraft in the lead. White tail stripes, red Hinomaru insignia, glowing in the morning sun. Lanphier rolled inverted, dove hard, and came up behind the escorting Zeros. Barber went for the transports. Cannon fire flashed. Tracers streaked like molten threads across the sky. 1 Zero exploded in a ball of flame. The others broke formation, climbing to engage. Barber's Lightning closed in behind the lead Betty, its twin tails framing the green bomber perfectly in his gun sight. He fired a 2-second burst, cannon and Brownings thundering in unison. The rounds tore through the fuselage, detonating the fuel tanks. The bomber erupted mid-air, wings shearing away, a column of black smoke spiraling into the jungle below. Yamamoto's aircraft was gone. The second Betty tried to escape, diving through clouds. Lanphier and Barber pursued, trading bursts through broken overcast. Moments later, that bomber too crashed into the forest. In less than 3 minutes, the war's most precise aerial assassination was complete. The escape, But the fight wasn't over. Zeros swarmed in defense, attacking from all angles. The P-38s, heavy with fuel and ammunition, climbed for safety. Engines strained. Turbo gauges hit red lines. At 25,000 feet, the Lightnings began their withdrawal. One was shot down. Lieutenant Douglas Canning's aircraft vanished in smoke. The rest turned south, diving back toward open water. Fuel was running dangerously low. Many pilots switched tanks in mid-combat, praying lines wouldn't vapor lock. One by one they throttled back, leaned mixtures, and settled into the long glide home. After 4.5 hours in the air, the survivors sighted Guadalcanal. They landed with fuel gauges nearly at zero. Mitchell's aircraft rolled to a stop, engines coughing dry. The mission had covered 1,004 miles, the longest interception of the war to that date. Every second had depended on the Lightning's range, speed, and climb. When word reached Washington, the official line credited ambush tactics. But those who understood flight knew the truth. Without the P-38's climb performance, the operation could never have happened. No other Allied aircraft could have reached altitude and position in time. Impact and aftermath. Admiral Yamamoto's death was a shockwave through Japan's command structure. Morale plummeted. Operations across the Solomons slowed as officers argued over succession. For the U.S., it was proof of concept. A message to both sides that technology and intelligence could work hand in hand. Back in the Pacific, the Lightning's legend was sealed. From that day, its silhouette became synonymous with reach and precision. The climb that morning over Bougainville, that perfect, timed ascent, was the embodiment of everything the aircraft had been designed for. Power, endurance, and altitude turned into strategy. Pilots who flew that mission never forgot the feeling. One recalled, "We rose from the sea into the sun, and the world seemed to tilt beneath us. That's when I knew. We were flying something the enemy couldn't touch." But the Lightning story didn't end there. Across other theaters, Italy, New Guinea, and Burma, it would repeat the same vertical miracles. The next part of the war would prove that this climb wasn't a single mission's fluke. It was a weapon. The climb as a weapon. Battles across the sky. 1943-1944. The legend of the P-38 Lightning didn't rest after Yamamoto's fall. Across the Pacific, its climb became both shield and sword, an invisible line separating survival from loss. Each theater revealed the same truth. In air combat, altitude was destiny. New Guinea, the vertical battleground in 1943. The Allied advance toward Rabaul demanded air superiority over the steaming jungles of New Guinea. The enemy held strong at bases like Wewak and Hollandia, guarded by swarms of Zeros and Ki-43 Oscars. American bombers couldn't operate without cover, and cover couldn't survive without altitude. That's where the P-38 came in. The 475th Fighter Group, under Colonel Charles MacDonald, developed a precise doctrine: climb first, strike second. At dawn, their Lightnings lifted from rough coral runways, drop tanks clanging loose, engines howling in synchronized harmony. Turbo superchargers spun to full pitch, the aircraft climbing through the coastal haze. Below, the humid air shimmered. Above, the air thinned, cold and blue. At 25,000 feet, condensation streamed off the wings. Pilots adjusted turbo wastegates manually. Left hand on throttle, right hand on the twin control levers, eyes switching between manifold pressure and temperature gauges. It was work, not art, but it worked perfectly. On August 16, 1943, MacDonald's squadron intercepted a large Japanese formation inbound from Wewak. The Lightnings were already 10,000 feet higher when radar first picked up the raid. Within minutes, they rolled inverted and dove, long silver arrows slicing through sunlight. Each burst from their nose guns tore through Japanese bombers like a buzzsaw. In the confusion, enemy fighters tried to climb, but the Lightning simply rose again. Turbochargers screaming, props biting thinner air, regaining altitude faster than pursuers could follow. That day, the 475th claimed 25 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 2 Lightnings. The report from 5th Air Force Headquarters summed it in one line. The P-38's climb advantage remains decisive. Engagements are won before the enemy reaches combat altitude. The enemy began calling them the twin-boomed ghosts, because by the time Zeros reached their height, the fight was already over. Italy and the Mediterranean. The twin-engined Eagle, while the Pacific wrote the Lightning's legend, the Mediterranean theater gave it its hardest proving ground. Here, in 1943-44, the P-38 fought the Luftwaffe head-on and learned new ways to exploit its vertical edge. Operating from bases in Tunisia and Sicily, the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups were tasked with bomber escort over the Italian mainland. B-17s and B-24s lumbered toward Rome and Naples, their contrails bright white against the blue. German Me-109s and FW-190s waited high above, diving into the bomber streams with deadly precision. To stop them, Lightning formations flew even higher. It was a brutal climb, sometimes starting over the desert, reaching 30,000 feet before the target coastlines appeared. Pilots used every trick. They throttled up gradually to avoid overheating, then opened intercooler flaps for the final push. The turbo superchargers worked hardest here, feeding the Allison's air as cold as the Alps. It was noisy, violent, and exhausting. But the result was an escort that could meet the enemy at equal or greater altitude. In one battle over Anzio in early 1944, a German formation attacked from above, expecting easy kills. But as they rolled in, the P-38 suddenly rose to meet them, climbing straight into their dive paths. One pilot later said, "They expected us to be victims. We became obstacles." Within minutes, 5 German fighters were downed. The Lightnings turned back to protect the bombers, leaving contrails shaped like looping white spirals. Even the bomber crews cheered when they saw the twin tails flash through the sun. Still, the European climate punished the Lightning. Engines struggled with cold starts, oil congealed, and the bulky frame lost some agility against nimble German single-seaters. Yet even here its climb remained unmatched. As one Luftwaffe ace admitted after the war, if the P-38 began above you, you had no chance to force it down. Burma and beyond, the forgotten sky farther west, in Burma and the China-India theater, another set of pilots discovered the Lightning's value in the unending expanse between mountain ranges. Reconnaissance versions, F-5 Lightnings, carried cameras instead of guns, but the same twin 1,600 horsepower engines. These unarmed aircraft relied on their climb to survive. Missions often began before dawn from dusty strips near Chittagong or Dinjan. Within minutes, they were ascending through Himalayan foothill clouds, bound for enemy rail lines or airfields hundreds of miles away. Enemy interceptors would scramble, Nakajima Ki-43s or Kai-44s, but they never caught up. By the time they reached altitude, the Lightnings were specks, camera shutters flicking silently. One pilot, Lieutenant John H. Tovey, recorded in his log, climbed to 38,000. Frost on canopy, turbos howling steady. Photographing Lashio. 2 Oscars tried to climb, gave up. These missions rarely made headlines, but their outcomes shaped entire campaigns. The Burma Road, the Imphal supply line, the planning for Chinese offensives, all were mapped from Lightning cameras. Their climb was their armor, altitude their invisibility. The engineering apex, P-38J and L, 3,200 horsepower of ascent by 1944, Lockheed's engineers had perfected the design. The P-38J introduced the chin-mounted intercoolers, solving the overheating problem once and for all. The P-38L pushed power limits even further. Each Allison V-1710 111 113 engine produced 1,475 horsepower at 60 inches of manifold pressure, with a war emergency power rating of up to 1,600 HP using water methanol injection. Combined, that was 3,200 horsepower. Thrust delivered through counter-rotating 11-foot propellers biting the thin air. In trials at Wright Field, a fully loaded P-38L climbed from sea level to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, 4 seconds. No other twin-engine fighter in the world came close. The climb was no longer a technical achievement. It was a psychological statement. When pilots throttled forward, the entire airframe trembled with force. The sound of the turbos rising in pitch was like a choir of machinery, metallic, harmonic, unstoppable. Crews on the ground would watch their fighters vanish vertically into cloud and whisper, "They're already gone." In combat, this meant initiative. The Lightning no longer reacted to attacks. It dictated them. Squadrons planned their strikes around the machine's vertical reach, rising above the enemy, controlling energy, descending in thunder. By late 1944, even as newer P-51 Mustangs took over the escort role in Europe, the P-38 remained the undisputed master of the Pacific. For long-range missions, nothing else could touch it. Its climb rate was still its crown, the silent guarantee that every mission began with an advantage. The decisive duel, Bong and McGuire, for the two greatest American aces, both Lightning pilots, climb was everything. Major Richard Bong, calm, methodical, from Wisconsin farmland, preferred high-altitude ambushes. He'd circle above Japanese formations, waiting patiently. When his oxygen ran thin, he'd dive, unleash a burst, then climb back to 30,000 feet. His 40 confirmed victories were the mathematical perfection of altitude control. Major Thomas McGuire, equally skilled, was more aggressive. The tactician who turned climb into choreography. His favorite maneuver was a steep oblique ascent through the sun, forcing opponents to overshoot and stall. In early 1945, both men embodied the P-38's spirit: precision, patience, and raw vertical mastery. They understood that the Lightning's true weapon wasn't firepower or armor. It was the climb. The turning point of air power. By the final year of the war, the Lightning had proven something larger than itself. That power equals reach, and reach equals dominance. It was no longer about who could turn tighter or dive faster. It was about who could arrive first. Every Allied commander knew that when the P-38s lifted off, they were already halfway to victory. Their climb erased the old limits of geography. The Pacific was no longer too wide, nor the sky too high. When Japanese ground troops watched the Silver Twins spiraling upward into the sun, many simply stopped firing. There was no point. They couldn't reach them. Not in altitude, not in time. That was the moment the balance of air power shifted irrevocably. The Lightning had reached its zenith, but every ascent carries descent. As 1945 approached, jet engines whispered from the horizon, the next chapter of flight already being written. Before the Lightning could fade, though it would shape the war's final outcomes and the peace that followed. Its climb had won battles. Now its consequences would redefine air strategy forever. The echo of victory. How the Lightning redefined air superiority. The war's final years belonged to the Lightning's shadow, a twin silhouette that symbolized the new order of the skies. By mid-1944, its presence was everywhere, parked on coral airstrips from New Guinea to Leyte, lined along dusty runways in Italy, streaking above Europe's winter clouds. For the Allies, the P-38 wasn't merely an airplane anymore. It was infrastructure with wings, a system of reach, reconnaissance, and dominance that changed how the U.S. Army Air Forces fought. Operational consequences. The most immediate impact was doctrinal. Before the Lightning, fighters were short-range tools bound to their bases. The P-38 proved that range and climb could expand entire theaters. With drop tanks, it could escort B-24s or B-25s over 1,300 miles. This shifted Allied air planning. Bases once considered isolated, Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, Mindoro, suddenly became springboards. Generals began designing campaigns around what the Lightning could reach. In the Pacific, General George C. Kenney used it as a spearhead, sending F-5 reconnaissance Lightnings ahead of invasions to photograph landing zones. Those photos guided amphibious operations at Hollandia, Biak, and later Leyte. In Europe, P-38s from the 15th Air Force escorted bombers to Ploiești's oil refineries and beyond. deep into Axis territory where no P-47 could follow. Even its failures taught lessons. When Lightnings operating in freezing conditions over northern France struggled with icing and communication failures, Lockheed engineers learned how turbo systems behaved in extreme cold. Those reports later informed post-war aircraft like the P-80 Shooting Star and F-94 Interceptor. The airmen and their machines for pilots. The end of the war brought reflection and fatigue. Many had flown more than 150 missions in the same airframe. Mechanics had names painted on cowls. Crews treated the twin engines like living things. The sound of synchronized Allisons spooling to life became both reassurance and warning, a reminder that each flight might be the last. In letters home, airmen described the Lightning not as a weapon, but as a partner. Lieutenant Charles MacDonald once wrote, "When you climb with her, it's like she knows you're counting on her to get you home." That trust wasn't misplaced. Records showed that more than one-third of all pilots who returned from engine failure incidents owed their lives to the P-38's twin-engine design. The aircraft's forgiving redundancy created a psychological safety net. It changed pilot behavior. They flew longer, took bolder routes, climbed higher. Each success fed morale, and morale fed performance. The human cost, but progress never comes without attrition. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 1,100 P-38s were lost to combat and operational accidents. Compressibility dives, tropical storms, and mechanical overheat took nearly as many lives as enemy fire. Still, crews accepted the risk. They understood that the Lightning was a pioneer's machine, the first of its kind to regularly operate above 35,000 feet, the first to cross the Pacific under its own power, the first to turn climb into survival strategy. When the war's tide turned firmly in Allied favor by late 1944, many Lightning squadrons shifted to reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Pilots strafed airfields, shipping convoys, and rail lines. Their precision nose guns made them deadly anti-transport weapons. In the Philippines, Lightnings destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground before they ever took off. Yet even as it conquered the air, the P-38's twin turbos demanded constant care. Keeping them running in tropical heat required almost ritual devotion. Mechanics logged 16-hour days, flushing intercoolers, balancing prop governors, replacing worn turbine blades shipped in crates marked "Urgent, Return Core." Each base became a miniature factory. Every flight hour depended on the invisible work of men with wrenches instead of wings. Strategic implications. When analysts reviewed combat reports in 1945, one statistic stood out: time to altitude. A Lightning could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 6 minutes, nearly twice as fast as most Axis fighters of similar size. Strategists realized that this metric predicted victory more reliably than speed or armament. The faster a formation reached control altitude, the more it dictated the engagement. This insight shaped doctrine far beyond the war. American planners began to think vertically, not laterally. Altitude became the new currency of combat, later translating directly into the age of jet interceptors and guided missiles. The Lightning's success convinced the Air Force that power through forced induction, turbo supercharging, then jet thrust, was the future. The transition from piston to jet wasn't a leap of faith. It was a continuation of what the P-38 had already proven, that oxygen-rich engines and high climb profiles win wars. Legacy of intelligence and engineering. After Yamamoto's death, U.S. intelligence recognized that success in the air required a fusion of cryptography, planning, and aircraft capable of precise delivery. Operation Vengeance became the case study in joint coordination. Every subsequent long-range precision strike, from Korea to modern drone warfare, traces its lineage to that 1,000-mile P-38 mission. Lockheed, meanwhile, took every wartime lesson back to its drawing boards. Kelly Johnson and his team filed over 500 design modifications during the conflict: aerodynamic, structural, and mechanical. The Lightning's turbo plumbing and dual-boom configuration influenced not only later Lockheed designs, but also the very concept of modularity in aircraft systems. From the P-38's nacelle emerged a philosophy. The idea that form follows function perfectly, when the function is flight itself. A symbol beyond its wings. As the Allies advanced toward Japan, photographs from island airstrips showed Lightnings parked in rows, their aluminum surfaces dull from salt and sun. Crews rested in their shadows, leaning against nose cones that had once pierced the stratosphere. Even in stillness, the aircraft looked poised to climb. The symbolism was not lost on war correspondents. Life magazine called it the American shape of ascendancy. Its twin booms, reaching outward, balanced, symmetrical, came to represent the twin forces of technology and courage. When victory finally came, pilots returning home watched as their Lightnings were pushed aside for newer aircraft. Some were scrapped where they sat. Others, stripped of guns, became photo survey planes mapping the very continents they'd fought over. A few lucky survivors were crated and shipped to museums. To the men who had flown them, each discarded airframe was a fallen comrade. But the Lightning's legacy didn't end in the scrapyards of 1946. What it taught, about altitude, about endurance, about the fusion of engineering and will, would echo in every cockpit that followed. Next came the reckoning. The numbers, the balance sheet of victory and loss, and the long view of what this climb truly cost and changed in the post-war world. The balance sheet of power, measuring the Lightning's impact by the end of World War II, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings had rolled off Lockheed's production lines. From the first XP-38 prototype that crashed on a New York golf course to the gleaming P-38L models escorting bombers over Tokyo, the aircraft's journey mirrored America's industrial transformation. The Lightning's legacy wasn't just counted in victories, though those were staggering. Across all theaters, P-38s accounted for more than 4,500 confirmed aerial kills, and in the Pacific, they were responsible for roughly half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by the U.S. Army Air Forces. No other Allied type held altitude and range in the same balance. Comparative power in the closing years of the war, the P-38's climb remained the yardstick for all piston-engine fighters. Engineers compared it relentlessly to contemporaries. Aircraft engine power time to 20,000 ft max. Speed combat range P-38L, Lightning II, X-1600 Satpex.2 Showmen 40 MP 300 Sat Mi P-50 D Mustang Gun, X-12.120, AP-7.0 Men 437 MPA Antantante Ficro, My F6F5, Hellcat 1, X, 2000, HP 8.22 Min Fanant Chadwadwadwayan, MP Chant 1945 Dawai, MIBF 119G61, X1525, HP.3 Min Thrakrin 208, MPH 560s, MIA 6M5, 01X, Heinwinson Harpy at Tait Nin, Min Tvaint Tavinur, MPR 160. My the machine that touched the sky, the war ended, but the sound stayed. Even decades later, those who had once stood on island runways swore they could still hear it. The distant, rising harmony of twin Allisons lifting through mist, fading into the blue. The P-38. Lightning had done something extraordinary. It made flight itself feel inevitable. In a war where men wrestled with gravity, the Lightning seemed to transcend it. 2 engines, 2 booms, 1 mind behind the stick, climbing through layers of air where oxygen thinned and sound fractured, until the horizon curved beneath. It was never about glamour. The Lightning wasn't elegant like the Spitfire or adored like the Mustang. It was angular, industrial, pragmatic. A machine born not from romance but from mathematics. Yet in that precision lay a different kind of beauty. The beauty of function perfectly executed. The pilots who flew it understood that. They didn't describe it as graceful. They called it honest. It did exactly what it promised. It climbed. Always. Altitude as philosophy. Altitude was never just a number on a gauge. It was an idea. At 20,000 feet, the world became quiet. At 30, the clouds turned into oceans. At 40, even the sky seemed to harden. Up there, power meant safety, and safety meant perspective. Every lightning that rose through those layers carried more than ammunition and fuel. It carried the logic of its time, the belief that engineering could elevate humanity above chaos. The twin 1,600 horsepower engines were not merely propulsion. They were conviction made mechanical, proof that precision could conquer fear. Yet every ascent also revealed fragility. Pilots learned that even the strongest metal trembles when pushed too far. Control surfaces locked, air thinned, and every climb had its limit. Beyond that limit lay silence and fall. The P-38 lived on that line, the razor edge between mastery and humility. Humanity reflected in metal war accelerates invention, but invention reflects its makers. The Lightning was built by people who believed in balance, between power and control, aggression and safety, destruction and protection. Its twin engines mirrored that duality. It was both weapon and refuge. It could kill swiftly, yet it could bring men home on one burning engine. It could rain bullets, yet it could carry cameras instead. It was a paradox in motion, the embodiment of what technology becomes when shaped by desperation and genius. In its form, you can read the contradictions of the century it came from: strength and vulnerability, courage and fear, vision and regret. The men who designed it never saw themselves as artists, but history paints them that way now. Kelly Johnson and his Lockheed team didn't sculpt marble. They sculpted atmosphere. They turned air into architecture, and in doing so, they built more than a fighter. They built a metaphor. The climb beyond war after 1945, the world changed faster than wings could keep up. Jet turbines replaced propellers, radar replaced instinct, and altitude became measured in miles instead of feet. But every contrail that carved white streaks across the Cold War sky owed something to the Lightning's climb. The U-2, SR-71, F-104, even the spacecraft that touched orbit, all were children of the same dream: to go higher, faster, longer. The Lightning was their ancestor, the first to prove that height was not just an advantage. It was a frontier. Its lineage runs like an invisible current through every high-altitude design that followed. In a sense, every astronaut who looked down at Earth saw the ghost of that silver twin-tail below them. Altitude became legacy, the emotional horizon. For the men who flew it, memory blurred into myth. They remembered the vibration under their boots before takeoff, the shimmer of heat mirage across the runway, the deep mechanical heartbeat of two engines becoming one sound. They remembered the climb most of all, that moment when gravity seemed to loosen its grip, when clouds turned into stepping stones, when sunlight burned through the canopy and made the world look peaceful again. One veteran, decades later, stood beside a restored Lightning at an air show and said quietly, "She always wanted to go up. Even sitting still you can feel it. She's trying to climb." That sentiment captures more than nostalgia. It's the essence of the P-38, the will to rise. Meaning in the ascent. When historians write about technology, they measure progress in horsepower and altitude, in speed and design. But the Lightning story measures something subtler: aspiration. It's a story about what happens when intellect and courage meet at the edge of the possible, about a generation that turned aluminum and noise into something transcendent, about how, in humanity's darkest hour, a machine became a symbol of upward motion, both literal and moral. The P-38's climb was never just about reaching higher in the sky. It was about reaching higher within ourselves. Every pilot who eased those throttles forward and felt the aircraft surge upward carried that truth, even if they couldn't name it then. That progress isn't about leaving the ground behind. It's about learning how to rise without losing the humanity that built the wings. The sky remembers today. When a restored P-38 flies at an air show, people still stop and look up. The sound is unmistakable. That rising harmony, that deep twin-engine resonance that once announced the future. For a moment, the decades fold away. The machine that once climbed through war climbs again, this time into peace. And somewhere above the noise, beyond the shimmer of propellers and sunlight, the sky remembers. It remembers the men who trusted it, the engineers who built it. The idea that flight, at its best, is not about escape. It's about perspective. The Lightning's contrails have long faded, but its philosophy remains: to climb when the world pulls you down, to rise through turbulence, to meet the unknown not with fear, but with lift. They couldn't believe it then, that an aircraft that large, that heavy, could climb like that. They believe it now, because the P-38 Lightning didn't just climb into the sky. It climbed into history. If the story of the P-38 Lightning moved you, the engineering, the courage, the climb, help keep history flying. Subscribe for more true stories of the machines and the men who shaped our skies, because remembering isn't nostalgia. It's gratitude, with wings.